Welcome to Career Practitioner Conversations. This podcast is presented by the National Career Development Association. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Melissa Venable, NCDA Director of Professional Development, and this episode continues our DEI series with a conversation about quiet quitting and quiet firing through the theory of work adjustment and social justice. I'm here with Dr. Frank Gorritz and Dr. Cheryl Love. Dr. Gorritz is a counselor educator at Florida Gulf Coast University, and Dr. Cheryl Love is a career counselor at the University of California, Riverside. Thank you both so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here for sure. Really excited to be in conversation with you, Dr. Gorritz. I get the opportunity to work with you as the co-chair of the Diversity Initiative and Cultural Inclusion Committee for NCDA, co-chair of the training subcommittee. And so I'm really glad to be in conversation with you today around this phenomenon that you have been researching and learning more about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quitting and quiet firing, especially through the theory of work adjustment and social justice. And so really excited to be in conversation with you today. So I'm going to start off by asking you, in your work as a researcher and educator, why do you feel it is important to pay attention to race and culture in the workplace? And then the second part, and how do these areas influence the mental health and well-being of the workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question because I think oftentimes what we don't realize, particularly for many of us who are in a socially dominant group related to race, related to gender, and many other protected social identities, we have no clue that our entire counseling field is literally written through the lens of socially dominant people. Through that, it invisibilizes everybody else. And initially, we don't think anything of it, right? We think and we go, we're writing about everybody. I understand what you mean. But we have to ask ourselves in the counseling profession and even in career counseling, whose voices dominate the conversation? Whose voices, racial voices, are often prevalent throughout the literature and have been throughout history, right? In being able to set the tone, be able to set the ethics, the guidelines for counseling. And so with that, we have a long history of what we do need to call whiteness. And so it doesn't mean that being white is a bad thing. Whiteness only points out the prevalence of how white racial identity and the culture associated with that is so predominant. And so that's something that I want listeners to just really think about. And that's why race and culture is so important, because if we're thinking about how the conversation has been carried out by socially dominant people, where are the other folks? Where are they in that conversation? And that also means, I'm going to get specific here. What that means is that if we have socially dominant people writing about career counseling, they are most likely writing about themselves, because it's not an innate gift that anybody has to be able to just peer into the racialized experience of another person. And so when they're writing about cross-culturalism from a socially dominant lens, nobody has even a clue of the things that people of color go through. There's no way we could even know unless the writer themselves lives through that experience, can talk through that language, because all of that is a cultural experience. And a cultural experience, I think, is much more deep and complicated than people think it is. And so if we have socially dominant people writing about career counseling, that leaves many minoritized voices out of the conversation. That leaves minoritized voices out of the case conceptualizations in our textbooks of how do we treat this? How do we treat that? And so the theories even attached to it don't even speak to the quote unquote racialized other. Not in a real way anyway, but just in an othered way. And that's why race and culture is just so important to consider in these conversations. And it affects people. Think about it. When you feel left out constantly, that can impact so many people when our voices aren't heard that we aren't even seen.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I love it. Whose voice or voices dominate the conversation? Something that we should all be thinking about, reflecting on in the work that we do. To carry on from there, how have you seen diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility issues related to oppressive practices in the workplace play out? How have you seen that? And what can career practitioners and researchers do to mitigate these issues?
Yes, that's a great question because I think here's one thing that I think we forget about: the word power. And so if we're talking about race, if we're talking about gender, we're talking about these politicized identities, what makes the isms so impactful and hurtful to minoritized communities is the power that is used against us. So with that being said, think about that in a career context. So if we are working in companies or workplaces where the folks who are in charge belong to a certain racialized group, especially a socially dominant group, like white communities who may not know about the lived experiences of POC, people of color, then they're the ones in charge of our paychecks. They're the ones who are setting up the norms for everybody else, even if they don't even realize that a lot of these rules and expectations are like, hey, act white here. And so that can be really stressful for people of color who we have many different cultural experiences that differ than the Eurocentric point of view that's often seen in the United States. Even for POC who are born here, it could still be very different, especially if we grow up around diverse families. It's hard for, I think, a supervisor or a manager to speak for the norms and appropriateness for everybody else. And of course, we have our basics, right? Don't hurt each other, don't do this. But when we look at culture, there's nuanced ways about hurting each other, etc., that we don't acknowledge. And in fact, it's pretty common as well that because whiteness is so prevalent, we have to remember where this country came from, built on the backs of who, the history of that. All of that carries down into the attitudes we have today. There's lots of really interesting literature that talks about it. Stands from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi is definitely a powerful read in talking about white supremacy and white colonization and how it has lingered throughout history. Because this is the ancestry that, we come from. And so we have to understand that not only cultural footprint, but that psychological footprint too, that may carry over into the workplace. And therefore power, I think, plays a huge role in how diversity is represented in the workplace, how inclusion is even practiced. So does inclusion mean that we make sure that we have a token from every group at the table? There are some white folks who still believe that, right? Or does it mean that all voices are at the table? Does it mean that we have Culture Appreciation Day, which I think is horrible? That's one of the tiniest things that people can do, right? It's like Cinco de Mayo every week. Like, come on, don't do that.
For sure. So, yeah, I really love the understanding the power that's used against us, really having an understanding of that footprint culturally, psychologically, and how that plays into the workplace and some of the trauma that we actually have to work through day in and day out in the workplace. And
because I think something that just came to me is that history, those footprints determine what is normal for us.
Oh, most definitely.
So if we don't question what's normalized, we carry on what was told to us before.
Yeah. Continue that, what I call generational trauma.
Oh, that's right. There you go.
Generational trauma. I know one of the things, and I'm really excited to hear you talk about this, early stages of the pandemic, to present day now, we have seen the increase of the phenomena of quiet firing and quiet quitting. And I know we've had conversations about this. And so just excited that you're going to get to share with listeners the work that you have been doing and have learned around these two things. So can you tell us about these phenomena and specifically how they have affected marginalized communities, Dr. Gorritz?
And I think that's why power is so important for us to recognize and acknowledge, because during the pandemic, the onset of the pandemic was a very scary time for so many of us. There was so much uncertainty, things that we didn't know about, but oftentimes too, we didn't address, and we're starting to address it more, but not many of us addressed the social inequities that were happening. For example, when you think about the onset of the pandemic, who has access to medical resources compared to other people, right? All of that also has to do with the isms of class and medical access. So we know that structural violence in general, when it comes to the isms, can deeply impact the way that a minoritized other can have access to even just live. We also know that weathering is a very serious effect of minority stress that especially impacts communities of color and Black communities, to the point where it even impacts our genetics. And so with that, those things, when the whole country is under stress, we have to wonder who are the people in power making the decisions for everybody else, right? Especially if we have supervisors and managers and business owners who are focused more on the income than people's lives. And so if we notice that there are really harmful workplaces that do that and prioritize the dollar over a human being because they quote unquote see human beings as replaceable, sadly, what happens too is we put these people at serious health risk, psychologically and physically, where we know statistics have pointed that out, the impact that COVID had on people of color and Black communities especially, right? The mortality rates were significantly different. But that's also because that social power still echoes throughout this country. Does that mean that every dynamic is this way across workplaces where there's like a racialized dynamic? No, but it's prevalent enough to where even like Michelle Alexander and talking about the new Jim Crow, that is very real, right? We talk about mass incarceration to be able to control and confine Black communities from succeeding. That stuff is very real. So then you throw the pandemic on top of it, and you also throw racial violence in there because we can't forget racial violence. If I'm not mistaken, like George Floyd, all of that was happening at the onset of the pandemic too.
Yes, you're not mistaken. Yes.
And I'm like, OMG. And many of us were hearing that and feeling that in quarantine or wherever. There were protests happening in the streets too. So even protests, regardless of COVID exposure, brave people of color and brave allies came out to resist and say it's already one thing where we have physical diseases killing us. And now you unapologetically continue to kill our communities more. So all of that, if you can imagine, will still always have an impact on the way that we perceive career, because we still have to show up to work or try to find work during all of that. And I think one of the biggest messages, I think this is really good for us to mention, that I think one of the most toxic messages of whiteness that I see in career counseling, and it's not necessarily career counseling, but you see it in career fields and it's used against people of color, is we have to leave our stuff at home. What's happening there has to stay at home and you have to be 100% here. But it takes a lot of racial privilege and psychological privilege for a white person to even say that to a person of color and to a Black person. You don't just say that to somebody. That's not how that works. Those social phenomena of violence still haunt us and they're still happening all around us. People of color are the ones who are on edge when they're even driving to work. So we can't literally just be told, oh, leave it all at home. No, the personal is political.
Yeah, I've been told that over the years. Yeah, leave that at home. And it is a space of privilege to be able to even say that to someone. I will tell you, I really liked the access to just levy. I think that for a lot of marginalized communities, it's just to be able to, I like to say, breathe.
Yes.
Challenge in of itself with all the things that are going on, racial violence, as you've mentioned, Dr. Gorritz. So for sure. So quiet firing, quiet quitting. What is that about?
Yes. So I think quiet quitting has actually been around longer than we think it has. So we have seen it starting to appear in the literature in the early 2010s. We saw it happening in Asia as well. And it was called lying flat when it was happening in China as protests against the Chinese president at that time, for workers to be like, no, we are not going above and beyond to hurt ourselves and sacrifice ourselves in the name of work. And quiet quitting speaks to this invisibilized exhaustion that happens. This exhaustion that happens that impacts the way we show up for work, the way that we tune in and connect to the work we do. Because according to the theory of work adjustment, we all have motivators that motivate us in our field of our line of work, right? And so quiet quitting speaks to that slow dying of those motivators, or the absence of those motivators, to the point where I'm just going to bide my time while I'm here and then just duck out, but I'm mentally checked out.
I have seen over the years, coworkers just do oppressive work environments slowly check out, as you've mentioned. So I've seen it firsthand where people are slowly just the motivators to come in and show up and do their best work slowly dissipate. And I think the pandemic really
100%.
helped to bring that out. And I saw in the institution that I was working with at the time, people just leaving in droves. But I agree with you, Dr. Gorritz, that guess what? This is something is not new, even though I think the pandemic really helped bring it to the forefront. But
yeah,
it's been around.
Yes, it has. Because even too, as a counselor, I think some people ask me, what's your stake in this for career counseling? Why is that so important to you? And I think it's because I'll never forget that I was actually working throughout the whole pandemic. So I worked at a psych hospital at the time.
Okay.
A psych hospital just doesn't close down. But unless you worked in a psych hospital during the onset of the pandemic, you should have seen the many people who were literally feeling displaced because of the pandemic, psychologically displaced, many of them being disproportionately people of color because of the stress associated with work, whether that meant their work was requiring them to show up so that they would risk infection or lose their jobs, or jobs were getting cut because of the recession associated with public business. So with that had a huge impact on so many people. Our numbers where I was working were at an extreme high. And I remember that even us, we were low staffed because of the pandemic, work upon work, right? So counselors, even working with people who are struggling with work, are also still working at the same time. Right. Work is a fundamental part of our lives, especially in America, where the Protestant work ethic is very predominant. Where if we're not doing work, we're considered lazy.
Right.
And the racialized myths that are associated with that even too, we had many people of color being impacted by those myths. The welfare queen, the mammy, right? All of those things, we saw that for Black women experiencing that too. And you have to look at that and go, I can't sit by and continue to watch this happen. I need to learn more. I need to learn more about racially responsive, culturally responsive career counseling. And as a Latina person, I'm trying to be the best ally I can be, because I can't say, oh my gosh, I can speak for all people of color's experiences. I can only speak for my own, because even my intersections make me unique in there too, as like a Latina gay person. But like with everybody else, I want to be a serious ally for everybody else, because what's happening is not right. It's not right at all. And we should all be enraged. We should all be unsettled. The onset of the pandemic should have unsettled many of us. But I think I saw it more firsthand because I was working at the psych hospitals at that time, while other people may have been quarantined at home and we didn't see the chaos firsthand.
Yeah. And distance from chaos can make one apathetic from the challenges that other folks, especially marginalized communities, faced. And so I love the fact that you were saying, hey, I needed to know and understand more so that I could be an ally and really be able to help folks who were struggling, dealing with quietly disengaging from their work, or having bosses quietly firing them by creating an environment where they could no longer be in the workplace. And just want to, I know as we get ready to close with our time together today. And I could stay and talk with you for hours. I just love talking and working with you, my colleague, my friend. But as we get to the end of our time together today, how can the theory of work adjustment, because you've touched on it a little bit, but how can the theory of work adjustment and social justice help us to better understand quiet firing and quiet quitting? And most importantly, help practitioners and researchers help their students, help their clients, especially from marginalized communities,
Yeah.
deal with these issues. And so they not are just surviving, thriving.
Yeah.
And period.
And we're going to bring it home, I think, through this explanation, because I think there are so many factors that tie in together. So we talked about quiet quitting, but many times because structural violence is so prevalent, quiet firing is also happening at the same time, which means that literal supervisors, business owners, employers are actually sabotaging some of this access to resources and needs that people have in order to make them go. What may look like quiet quitting is actually quiet firing that's happening. And the major gaslight that happens towards those people is, oh, you're quiet quitting, when in reality, they were quiet firing you because of all the structural violence they may have been able to get away with at the time. And so being aware of that, I think, is key. We need to be able to really understand when we are working with a variety of minoritized people across the dynamics and spectrum of race, gender, et cetera, but especially race, because with race, there's such a strong history of violent colonization that's still happening to this day. Y'all read the new Jim Crow, read it. It's a powerful read, right? So with that these forms of violence specifically impact communities of color, specifically impacts Black clients. And so it's especially important to think about how the theory of work adjustment might be, when we think about these motivators and reinforcers, how they're being used against people of color as another form of violence. And that's why theory of work adjustment, I think, is so powerful, because I think it illuminates that. It illuminates the motivators that keep people and the absence of motivators that cause people to leave and might even force them to leave. And so all of that is still connected to racial and systemic violence. So I hope that this explanation ties it all together in a nice circle and cycle here of what we're seeing, because it's a cycle of violence. It is a cycle of institutional violence. And we do have to be aware of these things so we can actually speak to the lived experiences of our clients. And by speaking to those experiences, just literally holding space for those clients as they share their experiences, believing them, not trying to placate with like white specialized techniques for career counseling that weren't made by actual people of color, but working with people of color in creating new ways to respond to career counseling, new techniques, new theories that are by us. I think that's where this, yes,
bias
and for us, which I think that's where it can start and continue. It is part of decolonizing counseling in effect too.
Yeah, and dealing with the, as you have said, structural violence, the gaslighting that has oftentimes been, like you said, quiet firing. People are thinking it's quiet quitting. And so I really love that. You wrapped it up in a nice, neat bow for us, Dr. Gorritz, but want to, as we conclude, you've mentioned a couple of must reads as we've been in conversation today. Just want to have you recap, because I know the last one you mentioned was the new Jim Crow. But in addition to that, what are some of the other must reads so that people can do the work that they need to do to be able to be responsive to all of their clients and students, not just some? So what are some of the critical reads you would say as it relates to this conversation we've been having about quiet quitting and quiet firing and, the theory of work adjustments and social justice? So what would you say, in addition to the new Jim Crow, would be some critical reading that the listeners should find the time to do to help this most important work?
Go back to your basics for sure of like Black Feminist Thoughts by Patricia Hill Collins, so that you can get an understanding of the intersectionality of how race and gender intersect, because that's often an ignored aspect too, in addition to other intersectional interlockings, if you will, between race and another minoritized identity. I would say my girl, Angela Davis, anything by her, she's lit because she is somebody who speaks very well to structural violence. Like she knows that stuff. She's an expert. She knows how to deliver and like really talking about these phenomena and bringing up historical examples to show us how not only has it been happening, but it's still happening in various parts of the world. So definitely Angela Davis, Ibram Kendi. Those are my people. If they're listening, I love y'all. It's just, I think those books really inspired me in my learning, and I'm always trying to continuously read more as well. So if you have any recommendations, sound it off with NCDA. Let us know so that the career counselors who are listening can definitely get a hold of those reads and start reading them.
For sure. And then last but not least, any suggestions for folks who want to get a better understanding on the theory of work adjustment and social justice? Any literature that they should take a closer look at so they can get a better understanding of those things?
And that's actually a good question because I think in writing about this topic, I realized that not many people tied them together. And that's like really scary. So if we actually know that there are some writers out there who, let's be honest, have been invisibilized by academic journals, because even that has racism attached to it too, right? The beautiful works of people of color that get denied for no reason, it's too political, etc. They may have written about it already. So this is the time where we start putting the word out there, start asking the people around you, your scholars of color, hey, do you notice anything about work adjustment and minority stress in the workplace as a read? Because all of those types of reads, as it is, connecting to the lived experience, can teach you a lot more about the theory of work adjustment in actual practice. And of course, you can look up the theory of work adjustment itself and the model, but from 2005, you can literally Google it and read the original career counselor's work on that. I don't want to butcher their name, so I'm not going to.
Oh, right.
But with that, it's just one of those things where the more you connect to the lived experience of minoritized people, you'll start to see the theory of work adjustment in actual practice.
For sure.
You just have to hold the model up and go, hey, wait a minute. That's what that person experienced when they were at their work. When you look at the lived experiences and the stories that minoritized people are writing about the world of work and their experiences in it. And if there's not enough literature on it, then we need to start writing about it because I know there's plenty of people who have stuff to say.
That is definitely the truth, Dr. Gorritz. And again, thank you so much for being in conversation with me today. And then, of course, the work that you're doing with me as part of the NCDA Diversity Initiative and Cultural Inclusion Committee, serving as co-chair with me for the training subcommittee, where we get to create some amazing content, including this conversation today and more to come as part of the NCDA Symposium podcast series. So again, a pleasure being in conversation with you today. And I look forward to more conversations around this topic as well as other critical topics as we do the work that needs to be done around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility.
Fingers snaps to that. And I hope, though, too, that the people who are listening, especially our communities of color, our Black communities, I hope that you felt seen in this conversation. I hope that our conversation was at least able to give that to you. So whatever gaslighting you may have received from your employers, it's not in your head.
It's not you, it's them, as I like to say. Anyway, thanks again, Dr. Gorritz.
Thank you.
Look forward to more conversations real soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.